Um, Hi, Assalamu alaikum. I hope everyone can hear me. Uh, am I? Can you hear me? Okay. So, welcome everyone to building large-scale web apps with Angular. And I'm Wafa Wahida. I'm from GDG Doha. I am a software engineer who has been developing front end for most part. Uh, Today we'll be seeing how to build scalable web apps and how it's a challenge these days, especially because front end and web apps is mostly built using JavaScript. As a front end engineer, I learned to tackle this with state management and other few design patterns, which I hope to share in this presentation. Uh, we'll be going through Angular framework and also the state management library called NGXS. We'll also be going through some demos on stackblitz. I mean, if you don't see code, what's the fun in it? Like, if you just keep talking about it and not see it. Yes, let's begin. And I'll be answering questions at the end of the session. Yeah, let's get started. This talk is part of Google MENA Digital Days, and it's a 16-week program, and they have each week is centered around a theme. And today we are seeing this talk is belonging to Google Technologies, and you'll be able to see like these. If you follow the Google GDG MENA channel, you'll be able to see talks from Sunday to Thursday on various topics from different GDGs and Google developer experts across the world, across MENA. So, uh, like the time listed on the slide is UAE time. So, if you want to follow up, these are the links. Like, this is how you follow up. Yeah, let's begin. Building large scale web apps with Angular. Uh, I mean, I know it's a very big topic, right? Like, let's break it down and take it piece by piece. uh, so, web apps. What are web apps? Like, I mean, if you just have to formally define it, a web app is nothing but a computer program which utilizes web browsers and also web technology to perform certain tasks, like filling a form, collecting the data of the form, or purchasing something. Even that's essentially a form. So it's performing tasks over the internet, and this program is essentially like running on your web browsers. So to simply put it, that's your web app. And you can define, like, there are various examples over the internet. Like, one of them is e-commerce, like shopping, all shopping websites. uh, Social media is a good example of a web app. And also data analytics dashboards, like anything centered around, which is dealing with like showing you charts, asking you to interact with it or create your own kind of insights on the fly. So there are different use cases, and usually if you see, like, web apps are centered around a use case and they involve a lot of user interactivity. I think we're slowly getting around, kind of trying to differentiate between what a web app and a website is. So, this is often a very common question, and a lot of people get confused. Website is nothing but information organized. Like, if you wanna, just talk about your company, or if you are having, if you're a startup, and if you're about if you're about to just talk about what your startup is, your team members, or probably a contact page. So that's your website. Whereas a web application is an actual app, like what your startup is about. For example, if you're a online shopping website, say online gifts and flower booking website. So this is your web application. um, so you can just define this as, web, like to simply put it, web application is something like interactive, and it's defined by interaction with its user. It has a lot of functions in terms of features, whereas a website is informational and it's defined by its content. So now let's take we just saw what a web app is. Now let's talk about large scale web apps. We just spoke about tasks like data, and we mentioned the online form is an example of a web app, the social media site is a web app, and also like the data dashboards as web apps. So these web apps deal with a lot of data, because of obviously user is interacting, and you want to, you're asking the user to fill a form, or like register himself, like buy something. So this whole thing is like it's all data. Every user action is data. And you are like, as an app developer, you are collecting data, you're storing data, you're also processing data. So this is what it deals with. And today, we are going to talk about the data heavy web apps, like the large scale web apps, when you're dealing with a lot of features. Your site is like, your web app is filled with a lot of functionality. So like all these web apps, usual way to build them is using JavaScript. And given that we have a real stream of data now, like, how are you going to handle it? It's a challenge. And especially because it's data heavy, and your code maintenance is like, it's going to be a nightmare. Like, imagine all the callbacks you have to make, all the promises you have to wait for. Like, that's why I think, a lot of frameworks like React, Angular, all these have been built to rescue you, like, sort of, because they give you a structure and something which you can follow. So uh, like, we can also talk about briefly, like, the challenges which large scale you face with web apps, in terms of just the interactions. So you want your web app to be very efficient. Like, there shouldn't be any duplication, or like, the users filling a form, what if the form fails, or you fail to record a response. You also expect performance and reliability. For example, if you want, like, the user's weight to be entered in kilos, whereas you're in the front end you're showing it as pounds, like, all this. So it needs to be reliable as well. So and also, the things to consider while you're building like large scale apps is like responsiveness. That's one of the things, right? Like, you don't know who's accessing, like, who your end users are. It's At times they prefer multiple devices. So it can be their iPad, their phone, or their web, like, laptops. So responsiveness is something which you have to really consider. And I've put efforts towards maintenance in a bigger font, because as developers we face like a lot of issues just to making sure it's smooth, there are no bugs. Like, especially because when talking about large scale web apps, you have like a lot of features, a lot of data going from here and there. You need to, at a point, like, handle the state of your app. So these things that we'll be talking about in the next few slides. So there is also performance and cost. Like, obviously we are being funded, and they want, we want our app to be very performant. We don't want to like consume a lot of for doing just like a normal data process, like filtering something in an array. How can you, there are like 1,000 ways to do it in JavaScript, but how can you do it in an optimal way? So these are things to consider while you're building large scale apps. And I'll be discussing some tools, some design patterns, which hopefully will help you solve, like, will give you like a guidance towards how to build large scale web apps. uh, so now we'll be talking explicitly about Angular, like web apps with Angular. uh, so I'm sure like all of you are familiar with how feature rich and like the huge community support that Angular has. So the benefit of using a framework is it plays a lot of uh, like it plays a big important role in just code maintainability. It structures your code. You know where everything is. uh, like it gives you a sort of a pattern to write your code. So if you just talk about the benefits of Angular framework in particular, one page applications, flexible development, it has a huge community support, speed, performance. Also, like it's very simple and expressive. And since it's a framework, it's having a lot of things like TypeScript, and it's highly opinionated, and it kind of helps a lot because it's opinionated. So it comes with TypeScript and observables baked in into it. We'll see how all that is done. And also it has a simplified MVC pattern. This is what I spoke about. When there's like a code structure to it, there's when you're looking at something, which file you're reading, and what each of the file does. And it's also helpful like for data binding and fast loading. So this is like something which is key for a web app, right? Like this is what we're looking for. Uh, so now let's get into large scale web apps with Angular. So before that, let's just take a moment to talk about all the growing concerns that we have while we build large scale apps. I already spoke about callback hell, where JavaScript is asynchronous, and you have like, okay, you have one function, like you have a lot of functions, but you want to, depending on the user action, you want to do like call function A, B, and you just end up making like a lot of callbacks between function A and B. So this is actually a very growing concern amongst the developers, and they've taken a lot of efforts to improve the landscape of asynchronous JavaScript. So we've heard, like, I think you've heard of promises, obviously, like all promises, generators, the async await pattern. All these were solutions to kind of help with scalability and avoid, at least try to minimize callback hell. So another solution which we'll be going through in this talk is RxJS, state management and reactive programming. So let's talk about TypeScript for a moment, because we just said Angular is having TypeScript, right? So what's TypeScript? TypeScript is TypeScript is actually it's a superscript of JavaScript, and it provides optional static typing, which means okay, so you have JavaScript, right? Like you've written functions, and you just say var, for example. You don't define what the variable type is. You just call it var, uh, meaning it can be a integer, it can be a boolean. All this is kind of uh, that's declarative typing. So you're not explicitly asking it, like defining the type of a variable. You're just it's going to figure it out. The JavaScript, your browser engine is going to figure it out while it compiles your JavaScript. But TypeScript is static typed, because I mean, over here you have to explicitly mention the type of the variable that you're going to use. It is like a lot of people like TypeScript, but it's something which you cannot avoid with Angular. So it's like, I mean, one of the regular concerns that people have is, can I write JavaScript with TypeScript? Yes, obviously you can, because it's a superscript of JavaScript, and you can your regular JavaScript code works as is. So the only difference is you get optional static typing, which is great, and especially for a large scale, like an app where you're having a lot of features and a lot of code. it helps a lot with maintainability. So imagine you have so many functions, and you don't know which data is being returned where, what's the data type. So with all this, it helps a lot with code debugging. They also have uh, they also have code discoverability, refactoring. It helps with code navigation, bug prevention, and it's built on object oriented, which means that you can have classes, you can define an interface for a type. So yeah, just to put it, this is how the TypeScript website defines itself. They say that it is JavaScript that scales, and it is a superscript of JavaScript that which again transpiles to basic plain JavaScript, and it works on any browser. So it's any host. It's also open source. So this is with Angular, we get this baked into our large scale, into our web apps, because we'll be using Angular for our web app. Now let's look into the second concept of Angular, which helps with large scale web apps. Uh, the second concept is reactive programming. This is something else that's again baked into Angular. We mentioned promises, observables. So these are like a few things which have evolved to kind of control the asynchronicity, right? So now, like if you imagine this, your web app, if you have a lot of data coming through, it's essentially a stream of data. It's like so if you're just talking about Facebook, for example, you have your Facebook feed, whatever your the friends you've subscribed to, and the pages you've followed. All this data has to appear on your wall. So you don't know, this data uh, is is a stream of data. You cannot, and it's asynchronous in nature. You cannot estimate like when it's gonna come. You're just listening to it. So your Facebook app, your wall is listening to it. So like that's like, it's very hard to code for this particular like if you have to define a function for this in regular JavaScript, you don't know what to listen to. You'll probably have a function and say like make sure you stay in that function until you get that data. So you'll probably like use async await. So it's a little hard. So what reactive programming does, which is again baked into Angular through RxJS and observables, is that you can simplify your programming logic a lot, and you can make your program very easy to understand. So you can easily create and also like manipulate the event streams and data easily. um, so yeah, this is essentially like using a set of library which is called RxJS, reactive x RxJS. You can create streams of events and also modify it, like efficiently map it, filter it over this array or stream of data that you have. How can you perform like operations in a scalable way? So this library takes care of not just handling those that data. It also provides a lot of methods for manipulating or processing that data. So and uh, what it uses is observables. So observable is nothing but observer pattern. It handles data, like it handles different asynchronous events, and it does that with a finite like operation, that is like a single HTTP. But you can imagine this to be like something which you have it's a pipe. It's essentially like a variable which you're listening to. It's an open kind of like an open port which you're like just listening to or subscribe to it. So when and based on when the data comes, like whenever your friend is posting something, that has to appear on your wall, right? Like since you're already listening to it through this observer pattern, which is the observable, since you're subscribed to his changes, you'll be able to see this on your wall. So it's like one single operation, and you can also like record with the RxJS, you can uh, change the data like that you're getting from him, or you can map, you can filter. So Angular provides this service with the help of this library. So we'll be soon looking at examples. Maybe now is a good time for examples. So let's first look into how Angular looks like. But if you want to get started with Angular, this is your website, like angular.io. If you've never created a project before, this website pretty much has all details of how to create an Angular project and how to get started. So they use this service, this software as a service platform called stackblitz, which we'll also be using to compile our code, just to see some examples. Um, this is just like uh, code igniter or any other code pen, these services that you have online. So this is getting started over here. In this example, you can see you can actually create a project and follow it through with stackblitz. You also have setup where they'll show you how to install it and get it working on your local machine. So these are steps for you to follow to get Angular working. But since we are going to just look at examples, we'll be using the stackblitz examples. So we have Nitay Neeman, like who's the author of this stackblitz. We'll be going through his example to understand Angular better. So essentially, like if you look at web apps these days, the frameworks like React or Angular define uh, like use this terminology. So components is something which they use a lot. So they say that every piece of UI is a component. You can define a component to be a piece of UI. So this whole box you see is a component. This hero search, like this whatever is written, is a component, and this is a component. So they prefer a composition, like your web app is essentially just a lot of components composited together, like that's how, and each component is talking to each other. So while this is how the app looks like, let's because we are interested a lot in code, let's look at how the Angular app actually looks. So I found this example. Maybe we can start with this example first. Okay, sorry. So here for you can see app.component.ts. This when you get started with Angular already does like a lot of work for you. It asks while you're installing it if you want routing enabled, what is the default CSS package manager that you want. With just a series of questions and answers, it gives you the Angular CLI gives you a complete running environment. So this file app.component.ts is how you is kind of the parent component of everything, you could say. So this app is going to contain the entire web app. So you can see that it's using a component from Angular core, and it's having a selector, template URL, and style URL. So it's using something called as decorator, and that's how it's mentioning, okay, this is how you select this component. This is where you'll find the HTML of the component, and this is where you'll find the style of the component. And you also have like any functions or any data logic, or just behavior logic that you want to record, you'll be recording here if required. But it's always mentioned to keep your it's a good practice to keep your components very light instead of making them data or logic heavy. So for that, you'll use something like services, but I don't want to go much into that. So this is how your component looks like. And you can see the app.component.ts. TS is for TypeScript. And because it's now, like, this is a proof that TypeScript is already baked into Angular. So app.modules.cs is ts is where you define whatever, like, the components you need. uh, Declarations is where you declare all the components. So this app is having, I think, 5 components in addition to the app component. We can just go through the dashboard, or maybe the search component. And it also has a service is essentially where you connect to the data part. That's your API. And it's always recommended to make your services fat and your components thin, because services are already dealing with API, and any code formatting or data logic that you have, business logic, can be applied to your can be implemented in a service. So this is the app.module. It already has routing enabled. And now let's look at HTML. We said, like, here, Angular has a very declarative UI, meaning you can, HTML is already declarative, and you get to use HTML as is. For example, like, you see the h1 tag here, nav tag here. You're using raw HTML. Whereas in React, you don't do that. You have something called JSX, and you kind of populate your HTML. Yeah. So one of the benefits of Angular, which I find, is like, the HTML being very declarative. You can just go read and see, okay, this component is calling this component, and it's more readable, I feel. So we said we'll look at the hero search component, right? While this being the parent component, now app is having uh, it's having something called router outlet. So essentially, what it does, this router outlet does, is it connects to everything you see here is the route outlet. uh, it is having a nav defined. This entire nav, dashboard, heroes, these two things is what is corresponding to this HTML. And h1 is the title, which you've obviously already figured out. So this router outlet is how you render different content of the app, like different components based on your selection. So right now it's already clicked on dashboard. That's why it's set to active. Like, now if you click on heroes, you see something else. So this while this is entirely the app component, you're rendering the other components here. So the like, already you would have figured out that the dashboard component is having heroes, top heroes, and it's having another component called search. So if you look at app modules, we can see something called heroes component. This is probably the heroes component, and this hero search is the hero search component. So you can see how dashboard has composed, I mean, app app component has composed this. Now let's look at the dashboard components HTML. Here you can see, okay, top heroes, and you have the div which is populating all the heroes, and you have a hero search. So now if we look at the hero search, as you would have already guessed, it is a search bar. It has the hero search in it, and it's an input field with ng4 and all these things linked to it. So if you look at the search component, this is where a lot of Angular things are happening. Like, this component is logic heavy. So you can see that you're already you're having some observables here, because you've imported RxJS observable, and you also have a subject. So let's not get more details, like, into the code. But this is how general Angular is. And let's look at hero search service, because service is something which we said connects to the API, right? So we can see here that this service is having uh, it's it's uh, it's having injectable, and it's also having the http constructor. So here you can see that what this search does is essentially it performs a http get request to this url, and it's also simultaneously mapping the response, like it's modifying whatever this returns to the format that it wants. So I think this was enough of an introduction for just to see like what Angular is, like what Angular components, services are, and how it's built. Um, I mean, just one more thing which I feel is useful to share is how to import other libraries. So here you can see that Angular Forms is being used. This whole UI that you get, and even the logic, and there's a library called Angular Forms, which is provided by Angular. So here, like when you're importing this, you import it as a library, and you mention it here in the imports. So you can see like any Angular library which is built across, like you would be essentially able to import, like download it via npm and import it this way. So let's get back to where we were. So we spoke about how TypeScript is being used in Angular, and how reactive programming is used. Um, so now, like, let's look at state management. So I promised to talk about design patterns. So one of the design patterns which is known to like help with scalability is CQRS. CQRS stands for Command Query and Responsibility Segregation. It's actually an architectural pattern, and its central idea is to kind of separate reading and writing between different models. So essentially, when you just think of your front end, beyond just UI, you have to think of it from a data centric way, because now we are getting into a point where front end is not just fancy UI. With web apps, we have a lot of user interactions. We're collecting data, we're storing it, we're processing it. So all this is like being powered by front end apps now. And this pattern, that the CQRS pattern, it heavily talks about how to separate, how command and query should be separate. Like, the command is nothing but a user action that you perform. Say like searching in that hero box is a command, and query is something that returns data. For example, if you just queried for your component, like your Facebook example, going back to that, your wall is already querying when your app is open. You're already querying for new data. Whereas when you interact with it, like you're interacting with your friend's post, you're essentially doing a command, like an action, saying say you wanted to like it or share it. So this is an action. So this pattern talks about just isolating both of it. And this is the rationale behind having state management. So the CQRS pattern was developed, and like they wanted to have essentially like a predictable state container, which uh, which helps you write applications which are like consistent and run in different environments. So this will you can see here that there is your app component, just like the example in Angular we saw. You have one app component, and there's like several other components which are this is the app component, this is the dashboard component, like the example we saw, and this was having hero search. So if you look at it, it's kind of like your entire app gets into a model like this. And now like the way we need to think about, especially with state management, is with the picture on the right side. So you need to essentially think of it in a very decentralized way. So you're thinking in terms of like, all components just being there, all the pieces of UI are just there, and they're talking to something called store. So this helps, like, to keep the state of your application in one place. So if you already liked a person, your friend's post, that's essentially a yes. And I mean, it's a boolean, and it's some data which is recorded, your user action which is recorded in the state of your application. So uh, so each component, like, component, the search component can access this, the dashboard component can access this information. So if it's decentralized, if all of this data is put inside the particular thing called store, it gets very easier. And you'll see how the predictability of your entire app can become much more can become much more like stable and consistent. So you won't have like your app behaving weird on one browser, uh, like if you look at it in another browser. So let's look into like how this can be achieved in Angular. Uh, this can be achieved in Angular using a library called NGXS, and we'll go through the concepts of what it's built with, and we'll also see an example of this. Um, so NGXS is it's not built by Angular. It's built by another open source contributor. The library is like available for download. You can just install it through npm. So what it does, it is centered around multiple each of the blocks, each of the circles you see is uh, is one of the elements of NGXS. So you have before that, if you have like we talked about store, we talked about state, we just threw like a bunch of terminology, right? So now let's first like define that. Let's first define what they are and come back to that diagram. So store is nothing but a global state container. It has like all of the data of your app stored, all the user actions, the data you received from the API, the data you modified, the data you collected from the user. So all of this is there in the store. uh, uh, the store is having a state container, and this state container is what is having this data. And it also has a lot of actions, action dispatchers, and selectors, which we'll talk about now. Action is nothing but every user action, every user interaction with your app is can be described as an action, to just put it in simple words. So actions is nothing but the class describing the action to take and its associated metadata. So if you're doing like a like on your Facebook, I mean on your friend's post, so it can be called as a like friend post action. So that action can have like it's essentially like a function which you can define a type, and you can also define some payload, like who the friend is and at what time you liked it, information like that. So that's the metadata part. So just to uh, rephrase again, action is interaction, like I mean a user interaction essentially that you made, and this is what is triggering. You'll see when you look at the diagram again, you'll see how this connects, this all falls into place. So now state is again defined as class definition. Sorry, it's data, it's data of the component or data of the app, all the data that you're storing, you're collecting. So state is simply defined as a class definition of that. And selectors is select is just like how you can select like a part of that state. So now let's look at this diagram. So this component is essentially your app. The green box, the green circle you see is essentially your app. Now the user is interacting with the component, and you can think of an action being dispatched. This whole diagram falls into place if you imagine it like the user is interacting with your app, and this is what is happening in your code. So this exact thing is happening um, with state management and NGXS library. So the user has clicked on like or a button on your app, and an action is being dispatched, and this action is now responsible for changing the state. Mutate is a word for change. So it's changing this store, uh, like the global store. It's going to change. So he liked it. Maybe I'm going to add +1 to his post that I'm seeing. So this entire action is changing the store, and now you're going to this component, it has to refresh, right? Like you just liked something, it has to show +1, or it has to show that the like button has been liked. So this particular thing can be achieved by selectors. So you're selecting, like you mutated this the store, and now you're going to read that data. So you're reading that data by slicing this store using selectors. So that's the select. Now, if you just think of these three circles, this is what you get to implement with NGXS. And if you want to think of this whole functionality in in uh, as your web app being like the full-fledged web app, you have where you have plugins, you have a backend. You'll be essentially like your backends and your plugins will be essentially talking to the action itself, just like your traditional JavaScript app or your jQuery app, where you say, okay, the user has liked it. Now, like make an API call and store it, or you kind of query the backend, right? So this is what like your action is the connecting point here. Yeah. So now we know what the definitions are. Let's look at a state management example, NGXS example. By the way, this is the website ngxs.io, and the concepts that I just talked about are already explained here, and they have good examples and recipes for authentication or any common things that you want to do with your app. So and getting started, as you can see, it'll be like they also have documentation on how to install it. It'll be as simple as npm install, and from your Angular project, you'll just say npm install, and this will just get added to your package JSON. Anyways, so let's move on to the example. So let's first look at an app called To Do app. So this is again, the author is this person here. So if you look at the component of so if you look at what the app is having, it's just like what we saw in the Heroes app. We have a component.ts file. We have a this is like the central app component. You also have HTML and service. So let's look at it one by one. So here, the app component is essentially having a method called to do, add to do. I think it's always easier to start with HTML because that kind of gives you overall view of what is happening. So if you look at this, here it's saying, okay, just show me whatever is here, whatever is inside to do's as a list, as an unordered list. So hello NGXS was already there. So if I do something like hello GDG, it's going to get added. Okay. So the input is the input box, and the button that I just clicked is invoking an action. Sorry, invoking a function, which is called add to do. So this add to do is a method which is being called here. And what it does is it's dispatching an action. Uh, this .store.dispatch is how you dispatch an action. and add to do is the action. So let's look at the to do state. Like this is how the state looks like. uh, so here, if you see, you have the state, you're defining the action add to do here. You have the payload, you have the constructor. So here in the add to do, which is essentially like supported with the action decorator, if you just look at this part here, it's what it's doing is it's essentially getting the state, and it's mutating the state with whatever was sent in the payload. So add to do is coming is having a payload of to do item as we defined in the class. So what everything it does is it's just setting the state. This is again provided by NGXS. So the decorator, the set state, all of these are by NGXS. You're just mutating the state by setting it here. So this was an action example. Now if you want to look at a selector, let's implement a selector. We can do select. So if you do select, or maybe, okay, I think in this example I already have a selector. So let's just move, let's just carry forward to save time. So all this is doing is it's dispatching an action, and it's you're able to like get the data. I mean, get the to dos here using this service, right? So here the HTML, over here you have something called to dos, and you're sending an async to it. So how are you getting this to dos items? If you look at this function, this action is dispatching. It's essentially a observable, and you're just subscribing to it. So here you're getting the input value, and you're setting it from the state. So yeah, this to do's is what you oh yeah, see, this is the selector that I was talking about. So to do's dot dataset, it's just directly selecting from the state. It's selecting the dot dataset from the state. So this is like one example of NGXS. If we want to look at, like, we talked a lot about the like button. We said how to implement the like button. Like if you want to do that through NGXS, you'll have uh, you'll have like a class like this, and like let's start with the HTML first. Okay, so the HTML is just like here, like all of this is like the entire thing which you see here. So once you click it, it keeps recording what your state is. So the button is triggering the action which you're doing, this dot store dot dispatch and add. If you look at the state, you have the action called add, and you're just mutating the state. So I think this was a good overview of what NGXS is capable of. Like we saw what actions are and how to do a selector. So for a selector, you just directly kind of query it from here. So you're just slicing the state. So you just say count state and count, and you return what, because there's not a lot of things in the state. You can just do a direct select on it. All right. So now let's get back and see if you have any questions. Okay. So uh, we this session was about Angular TypeScript. So I just saw a question on what this session is about. And okay. All right. So I don't see any questions. I just wanted to talk about two more things about the attendance certificate and challenge. So these are the links for that. And since this theme is, I mean, this week is about Google technologies. You already have, I think, uh, in the chat the links are being provided. So thanks a lot. I hope we do good things. We build good things together. And thank you. That would be it.